In the sharp, clear autumn of 1978, Nora Callahan, at just 25 years of age, became the sole proprietor of a legacy written in fence wire and basalt rock. Her father, Liam, had passed in the spring, leaving her the deed to the Callahan Ranch, a sprawling and stubborn piece of the Oregon Cascades that clung to the mountainside like a burr on a wool coat. The inheritance was both a blessing and a curse, a truth that settled deep in her bones as she stood outside the valley's only general store, the afternoon sun warming the worn planks of the porch. The news had already traveled down the mountain faster than a spring melt. It wasn't the inheritance that had the old-timers talking, but what she had done with her first bit of savings. She had bought yaks. 18 of them. Let me tell you about the men who gathered there. They were ranchers carved from the same hard timber as the land itself. Their faces were maps of long droughts and hard winters, their hands thick and calloused from a lifetime of wrestling a living from the earth. They leaned against the porch rails, spitting tobacco juice into the dust, their collective wisdom as solid and unyielding as the mountains that ring their valley. Jebediah Thorne was their undeclared chieftain, a man whose family had ranched this land since before Oregon was a state. His voice was low and gravelly, accustomed to being obeyed by man and beast alike. He looked at Nora, his eyes a pale, unforgiving blue. He wasn't looking at a fellow rancher. He was looking at a girl playing dress-up in her father's boots. "Yaks, Nora," Jebediah finally said, the word hanging in the air like a bad joke. A few of the other men chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. I heard the rumor, didn't want to believe it. "What in God's name is a girl like you going to do with a herd of overgrown goats from the other side of the world?" Nora met his gaze. Her hands were tucked into the pockets of her denim jacket, her knuckles white. She didn't have her father's size, but she had his stillness. "Raise them, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Just like you raise your cattle." The laughter was louder this time, less restrained. "Cattle earn their keep," another man chimed in, a wiry fellow named Silas. "They put beef on the table and money in the bank. Those things, they're curiosities. Good for a picture postcard, maybe. Not for ranching." They believed they knew exactly what they were seeing. They saw a young woman, grieving and overwhelmed, making a foolish, emotional decision. They saw 18 shaggy, uneconomical animals bought from a desperate farmer over in the next county who was practically giving them away. What they couldn't see, what they had no way of understanding, was the landscape that existed only in Nora's mind, a map drawn for her over 2 decades by the patient hand of her father. They saw the ranch as it was. Nora saw it as it was meant to be. Now, let me explain the geography of the Callahan place. It was a magnificent, difficult property. Most of it was good, solid grazing land in the lower valley, watered by a creek that ran cold and clear even in August. But the heart of the ranch, the part that had obsessed Liam Callahan for 30 years, was a 200-acre parcel of high alpine meadow on the other side of a formidable granite ridge. They called the treacherous, shattered gap in that ridge Callahan's Pass, though some, with a cruel twist of local humor, had started calling it Callahan's Folly. A generation ago, a massive rockslide had torn the guts out of the old trail. It had become a geological nightmare of shifting scree, narrow ledges, and steep, unstable inclines. It was a place where the mountain was still alive and angry. The meadow on the other side was the stuff of legend. It was a Shangri-La of ranching, perfectly watered by snowmelt, lush with timothy and clover, untouched and ungrazed for 30 years. The soil was black and rich, a promise of unparalleled fattening pasture. That land was the difference between a ranch that survived and a ranch that thrived, but it was unreachable. Horses, with their high center of gravity and solid hooves, would panic on the shifting shale. A single misstep meant a broken leg or a fatal fall into the gorge below. Cattle were even worse, They were creatures of flat ground and gentle slopes, too heavy, too clumsy, too prone to blind terror. Every rancher in the valley, including Jebediah Thorne, had looked at that pass and declared it a lost cause. The 200 acres were written off, a ghost limb of the Callahan property, a painful reminder of what could have been. But Liam Callahan had never believed in lost causes. He was a different kind of man. He was a listener. While other ranchers looked at their land and saw a resource to be exploited, Liam saw a partner in a long and complicated dance. He walked his fence lines not just to check for breaks, but to read the story the land was telling him. He knew the language of the wind in the pines, the subtle shift in the color of the soil after a rain, the way the deer found paths that men could not see. He was a man of profound patience, a virtue as rare and valuable in that valley as a year without a drought. Nora grew up in his shadow, which was not a shadow at all, but a quiet, steady light. She didn't learn from lectures at the kitchen table. She learned by doing, by watching, by absorbing his philosophy through the soles of her boots. He taught her how to mend a tractor engine not just by replacing a part, but by understanding the purpose of every gear and piston. "Everything has a reason for being the way it is, Nora," he'd say, his hands stained with grease. "You just have to be quiet enough to figure out what that reason is." He applied the same principle to the mountain. For years, he studied Callahan's Pass. He never tried to force a new trail with dynamite or machinery, the way Thorne had once suggested. He believed that was an insult to the mountain, an act of arrogance doomed to fail. Instead, he watched it. He sat for hours with a pair of binoculars, observing the way the snow melted in the spring, the way the water cut new, temporary channels, the way the wild mountain goats moved with an impossible, delicate grace across the scree fields. He believed the mountain had not closed a door, but it simply presented a new kind of lock. You just needed the right key. And in his final years, he had left her the most important part of his wisdom, a tangible legacy. It wasn't money. There was never much of that. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his neat, deliberate handwriting. It was a record of rainfall, of soil temperatures, of calving dates. But tucked in the back were the pages that mattered most. They were filled with sketches, notes, and musings about the pass. He had drawn the mountain goats, marveling at their split hooves that could grip the smallest purchase. He had written about the bighorn sheep, noting their low, powerful build that kept them stable in high winds. And on one page, a page Nora had read 100 times, was a clipping from an old National Geographic. It was an article about the Himalayas, and there was a picture of a laden yak standing calmly on a narrow, snow-dusted ledge. Beneath it, her father had written a single line, "Some animals are built for the question the mountain is asking." That was the secret. That was the knowledge that separated Nora from the men laughing on the porch of the general store. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever held a piece of truth in your hands so clear and so powerful that the disbelief of others feels like nothing more than noise? That was what Nora felt. The ranchers saw an obsolete beast of burden. Nora saw the key her father had been searching for. She had spent the last 6 months after his death not just grieving, but studying. She read every book she could find on the species. She learned that a yak's blood is rich in hemoglobin, allowing it to thrive in low oxygen, high-altitude environments. She learned their multi-layered coats made them indifferent to the brutal cold that could kill a cow. And most importantly, she learned about their feet and their balance. Their cloven hooves could splay wide, distributing their weight like snowshoes on soft ground or shifting rock. Their low-slung, stocky bodies gave them a center of gravity that made them almost impossible to tip over. They were, in every biological and evolutionary sense, the perfect answer to the question of Callahan's Pass. Her decisive act was quiet, almost invisible to the valley. She drove her father's old Ford truck 3 hours east, into the dry flatlands where a man was selling off his exotic livestock herd. The farm was dusty, the fences were in disrepair, and the yaks stood in a dry lot, looking bored and out of place. They were magnificent primeval creatures, covered in long, shaggy hair with intelligent, curious eyes. The farmer, a man defeated by debt and drought, couldn't believe his luck. "You want all 18?" he asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Yes, sir," Nora said, counting out the cash she'd saved. It was nearly everything she had. "Mind my asking what for?" Nora looked at the largest of the herd, a massive bull with horns that swept out in a majestic curve. She thought of her father's journal, of the promise she'd made to his memory. "To pay an old debt," she said. Bringing them home was an ordeal. The journey in the rattling stock trailer was slow, and their arrival at the Callahan ranch created a stir that rippled through the valley. Cars slowed on the county road. Neighbors stopped their work to stare at the strange, shaggy beasts stepping into the Callahan pastures. The whispers followed her everywhere, from the feed store to the post office. "Liam's girl has finally lost her mind. Callahan's Folly has a new fool in charge." She ignored them. She had work to do. The subsequent 2 years were a masterclass in patience, a long, quiet conversation between a woman, a herd of animals, and a mountain. She didn't rush. She spent the first winter just earning their trust. She learned their names, which she gave them herself. Goliath, the great bull who was their anchor and king. Sheba, the wise old matriarch who made all the real decisions. Moses, a young bull, always testing the boundaries. She learned their language, the soft grunts of contentment, the sharp snort of alarm, the low hum that seemed to be the sound of the earth itself. She learned that, unlike cattle who stampede in fear, yaks, when faced with a threat, would form a defensive circle, their horns facing outward, calm and resolute. They were thinkers, not runners. In the spring, she began their training. She didn't use force or fear. She used the yak's own nature. She started by leading them along the rocky banks of the creek that bordered the property, a miniature version of the pass's terrain. At first, they were hesitant, but Sheba, after studying the problem, would find a path, and the others would follow her lead. Nora watched, amazed, as their split hooves found purchase on slick, wet stones where her own boots would slip. She saw Goliath use his massive head to nudge a loose boulder out of the way. They were not just navigating the terrain, they were engineering it. This was her first, small success, a private victory no one else could see. It was the moment the theory in her father's journal became a living, breathing reality. The whispers in the valley continued, of course. Jebediah Thorne would sometimes drive his new pickup truck slowly past her fence line, a look of pity and condescension on his face as he watched her work with her circus animals. He saw a young woman wasting her time on a fool's errand. He didn't see that she was forging the key, one step at a time. There was a moment of private doubt. Of course there was. It came in the heart of the second winter, a brutal season of deep snow and howling winds that seemed determined to scour the mountainside clean. Nora was exhausted, her body aching from hauling hay through waist-deep drifts, her savings dwindling to almost nothing. One night, a blizzard raged outside, rattling the windows of the small ranch house. She sat at the kitchen table, her father's journal open in front of her. The loneliness of her task felt immense, a physical weight pressing down on her. The laughter of the men at the general store echoed in her ears. Were they right? Was she just a foolish girl, chasing a ghost, honoring a dead man's fantasy? She almost closed the book. She almost gave in, but her eyes fell upon a passage she had underlined. Patience, her father had written, is not about waiting. It is about maintaining a good attitude while working hard for what you believe in. The mountain doesn't reward haste. It rewards respect, and respect takes time. Reading his words felt like him placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. The doubt didn't vanish, but it receded. It became smaller than her purpose. She got up, put on her heavy coat, and went out into the storm to check on her herd. They were huddled together, their backs to the wind, their thick coats covered in a layer of snow, completely unbothered by the tempest. They were calm. They were waiting, and so would she. When the third spring arrived, she knew they were ready. The process of opening the pass was not a single dramatic event, but a series of deliberate, careful expeditions. She started by clearing the first few hundred yards of the trailhead, not with machinery, but with the yaks themselves. They became a living work crew. Goliath would push smaller rocks aside, while others would patiently wear a path through the stubborn brush. Nora worked alongside them with a pickaxe and a shovel, her movements economical and sure. She then began to push further, using a system. She would take a small group of the most sure-footed yaks, led by Sheba, up into the treacherous sections. They would move slowly, testing each step. Nora didn't lead them. She followed, trusting their instincts. When Sheba deemed a section too dangerous, she would stop, and they would backtrack and find another way. Nora marked the viable route not with flags or paint, but with small, discrete cairns of stacked rocks, a language only she and the mountain would understand. It was a slow, painstaking process of weaving a thread through the eye of a needle. The final push came in late summer. The air was thin and cool, the sky a deep crystalline blue. She took the entire herd. The valley ranchers, had they been watching, would have seen a strange, dark procession moving slowly up the mountainside, disappearing into the shattered rock of Callahan's Folly. The journey through the pass took 2 full days. There was one moment, on a ledge no wider than a dining table, with a sheer drop of 500 feet to one side, that her own nerve almost broke. The wind howled, trying to push them from their perch. But Goliath stood firm at the head of the line, a rock against the storm, and Sheba nudged her gently from behind, a gesture of silent encouragement. She held her breath, put her faith not in herself but in them, and walked on. And then they were through. They emerged from the narrow, shadowed gorge into the brilliant sunlight of the high meadow. It was more beautiful than she had ever imagined. It was a sea of green, dotted with wildflowers, silent and pristine. A small, clear lake reflected the snow-capped peaks that surrounded them. The air was clean and sweet. For a long moment, Nora just stood there, her heart too full for words. The yaks, without any prompting, spread out across the meadow and began to graze, their soft grunts the only sound in the vast, quiet cathedral of the mountains. The debt was paid. Vindication did not come like a thunderclap. It arrived like the slow change of seasons. For the rest of that year, Nora rotated her herd between the lower pastures and the high meadow. The effect was immediate and profound. The untouched, nutrient-rich grass of the high country put weight on her yaks at a remarkable rate. Their coats grew thick and glossy. When winter came, her herd was fatter, healthier, and more robust than any cattle herd in the valley. She had so much surplus grazing that the lower pastures had time to recover and grow stronger than they had in years. She had not just gained 200 acres, she had healed her entire ranch. The whispers in the valley slowly changed. The laughter died out, replaced by a grudging, confused silence. People would see her leading a packed train of yaks, laden with supplies, effortlessly trotting over the pass that had defeated them all. They saw her bringing down animals for market that were healthier than any they could raise. The economics, which they had mocked, were suddenly undeniable. She had no feed costs for half the year, and her veterinary bills were almost zero. The yaks were not a liability. They were a competitive advantage forged in the heart of the mountain. The acknowledgement came the following summer. It was a dry year, one of the worst in memory. The lower pastures of the valley were turning brown and brittle. The ranchers were starting to sell off cattle they couldn't afford to feed. Jebediah Thorne's herd was suffering badly. His prize-winning Herefords looked thin and miserable in the heat. One afternoon, he drove his truck up the road to Nora's ranch and stopped at the gate leading to her lower pasture. He just sat there for a long time, watching. Nora was mending a fence nearby and saw him. She walked over, her movements unhurried. He got out of the truck, taking off his hat and wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked older, more tired than he had 2 years ago. He avoided her eyes, looking instead at the healthy green grass inside her fence line. "Callahan," he said, his voice raspy. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her tone even. He gestured with his hat towards the high country. I see you got the pass open." "The yaks opened it," Nora said simply. There was no triumph in her voice, only a statement of fact. He finally looked at her, his pale blue eyes filled with a weary confusion. "How did you know about them animals?" Nobody ever thought of that. Nora thought of her father, of his worn journal, of his quiet lessons. "My father listened to the mountain," she said. "I just tried to do the same." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the wind. Jebediah Thorne looked at the ground, then back at her. He seemed to shrink a little, the arrogance that had defined him worn away by the harsh reality of the drought and by the quiet, undeniable success of the woman standing before him. "He would be proud," he said, the words coming out slow and heavy. "We were wrong, Nora. I was wrong." He stuck out his calloused hand. She took it. The handshake was firm, a treaty signed between the old way and the new. The story, of course, doesn't end there. The narrative jumped forward, decades unfolding like the turning pages of an almanac. Nora Callahan never became boastful. She never once said, "I told you so." She didn't need to. Her success spoke for itself, a quiet, powerful testament to her father's wisdom. The Callahan Yak Ranch became a landmark, a model of sustainable, high-altitude agriculture. During the beef market crash of the 80s, when ranchers burdened by debt and high overheads were losing their land, Nora was secure. She bought 2 neighboring properties, including a piece of the Thorne Ranch, paying cash both times. She didn't conquer the valley, she simply endured, and in enduring, she prevailed. The fruits of her labor were not just financial. She became a respected elder, a figure of quiet authority. Young ranchers, struggling with the new realities of a changing climate, would come to her not for loans, but for advice. They would find her not in an office, but in a pasture, her hands still busy, her eyes still watching, still listening. The worthless animals had become the foundation of an empire, and Callahan's Folly was now known simply as Callahan's Pass, a vital artery for the most prosperous ranch in the county. In her later years, you could often see her walking the pass, now a well-worn and stable trail, with her granddaughter, a girl with the same quiet stillness in her eyes. One afternoon, sitting on a rock overlooking the high meadow, she passed the girl her father's journal, its leather cover now soft and supple with age. "This book isn't about yaks," Nora told her. "It's about listening. It will teach you how to hear what the land is asking for. If you can do that, you'll always have the right answer. So, let me leave you with this. The men gathered on that porch all those years ago saw a foolish girl, a herd of worthless animals, and a broken mountain. They saw only the obstacles. But Liam Callahan had taught his daughter to see the world differently, to look for the key that fits the lock, no matter how strange it might seem. They said she could never tame the mountain, and they were right. She didn't. She respected it. She learned its language, she understood its nature, and in the end, the mountain let her pass.